Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Last year, I had the honour of interviewing an award-winning novelist whose debut novel became an overnight sensation. As the winner of the Banjo Prize in 2020 with a novel that was then titled Flood Debris, Dinuka McKenzie quickly became a household name when her book, The Torrent, was eventually published by HarperCollins at the beginning of 2022. Now in 2023, Dinuka has followed up on the success of The Torrent with another brilliant book called Taken. In this novel, we pick up where The Torrent left off and follow the trials and tribulations of Detective Kate Miles as she navigates her return to work after the birth of her second baby, only to be tasked with investigating a high-profile and emotionally difficult case involving the abduction of a baby. Tense and page-turning, this story had me invested from the get-go, riding alongside Kate on the emotional roller coaster that is her life as she tries to spread her time and attention across a myriad of competing demands. Absolutely riveting reading, and I'm more than a tad delighted to have the chance to speak with Dinuka again today. Welcome back to the podcast, Dinuka.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine, for that amazing introduction. You've done my elevator pitch for me, so I don't need to anymore. I should just take you along to all my sessions. And this is exactly what Claudine said. Thank you.
Dinuka, your second book has now officially made its way out into the world. So I wanted to ask you, how are you feeling, and do you think you were more nervous this time around, or is it much of a muchness?
Oh, it's definitely not much of a muchness. I would say compared to the release of 2021, before that came out, The Torrent came out, that nervousness went for ages, only because I guess when I won the Banjo Prize, that was 2020. So that was September 2020. The book came out February 2022. So that was a long lead time, right? And so there was a lot of time for people to be incredibly excited and so lovely. But in my head, that expectation felt monumental, like, that I would never be able to kind of achieve the expectations that the Banjo Prize had raised, So I was incredibly nervous. Not only was it my debut, but it was also attached to that prize. And so I really, not that anyone put that expectation on me, but I probably took that on. And so I really felt those nerves. It was all brand new, all of these interview things, everything was brand new. So yes, so I would say I was way more stressed for that than I am for this. Certainly, I guess maybe the talking side of it is probably a bit less nerve-wracking. What I will say was the same amount of nerves for this one as well was definitely the ARC process. So that's the advanced reader copy process. So they send an advanced copy out to kind of other authors and, your hero kind of authors, people you have on your bookshelf to get, early endorsements. And that process was just as stressful as I remember it being for The Torrent. I essentially had like a month of complete anxiety brain where, because you're still fixing up the book in the background while it's being read by other people, by your heroes. And so you feel even more exposed beyond just the fact that they're reading your book. You're in your head, or certainly in my head, in my anxiety head, they're reading like not the, polished version. So it feels, certainly for me, it felt really anxiety driving. And so that process definitely felt the same, but I'm probably far calmer in the pre-release than I was for The Torrent, definitely.
Yeah, the arcs are an interesting thing, and I heard you talking about this at your launch, and I've spoken about this with other authors and writers, and it's a bit of an anachronistic situation, really, where you're sending out advanced reader copies for people to get early endorsements and the like. But as you say, you're sending your work out into the world where it's not really in its most polished and final format. Obviously, the gist of the story is still the same and whatnot, but it just seems like such an unusual situation for wordsmiths who are obviously very keen to ensure that the most polished product is out there.
It definitely is. And I think that is something, as a new writer, or I guess a new writer getting published, it's something you don't really think about that much. And it's really interesting because at each stage you think, oh yeah, that's a really good version, and at the end of the copy ads, I was really happy with it. Like a month later, I come back to the proofs and I'm like, oh my God, what is this? What are these sentences? It's awful. And then by that point, I cannot like claw it back. It's already gone to those authors. Most probably for them, they won't probably even notice these things, but you notice them. And I must admit, you are still making tiny changes. For this one, for example, between the ARC copy and the final version, we actually ended up inserting a final section of the unnamed narrator. So I think in the ARC version, there's 4 of those, and I think in the final version, there's 5 of those unnamed narrator kind of little sections that appear in the book. So you are making those kind of changes. And okay, so with the editing process, this is the funny thing. When you get your kind of structural edits, it's like the big stuff, right? So it's the big picture stuff. And so when you're editing, you are focusing on the editor's comments, like the problems that have been put to it. So you're looking at it in terms of that. Then when you do the copy edits, they have found a whole bunch of repetitions, and you find out the horrific writer tics that you have. You literally find out that you say suddenly 50,000 times, or Kate was apparently doing a lot of things with her stomach and belly, and there's just like 50,000 references to her belly, and I'm like, what is going on here? So then again, you are focusing on a problem that's been identified, right? So it's like you have to get rid of it's like a process of weeding. It's like you can't see the tiny, tiny, tiny weeds until you've gotten rid of all the bigger weeds, right? And so by the time you get to that proof edit stage, to my brain, it feels like, oh my God, that sentence is so obviously bad. I should have picked that up. But actually, I couldn't see it at that point because I was so concentrating on the much, much, much bigger weeds that were there, or pruning all the other stuff that was there. So it's like this process of pruning, and then you finally see the final little weeds and the bits that weren't there that were hiding in the bottom. Because that structural edit really feels like you're organizing the garden, where the garden beds go, this is a really terrible metaphor. Anyway, I'm trying to say.
It's good. I totally understand.
That's what that process feels like. But in saying that, I'm sending out to people who kind of know the process themselves. So they are forgiving in that way. It's definitely not something I have got used to. And my publisher agent knows how stressed I get at that particular stage.
I was going to say that exact same thing, but I guess on the plus side is that you are sending to people who are in the know, who are either in the industry or are aware that this is just one of those quirky things, and that those things will eventually be picked up and fixed.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all like the time frame things, because they're always kind of working backwards to work out, okay, well, we need to have, this printer by this date in order to go out to get those endorsements, in order to have those words, in order to get to the final print run, in order for it to be ready for the warehouse. It's all like they just work backwards, and they go, okay, this is when your manuscript needs to be delivered type thing. Yeah. So it's always working backwards, and there's movement in those dates a little bit, but that's how all that kind of comes about, where you have to do those early copies. So yeah.
Fantastic. So Dinuka, in preparation for this interview, I had to say that I marveled at the incredible support and admiration that the Torrent received when it was published, and also Taken is deservedly receiving similar terrific feedback. So what I wanted to ask you was, when you were writing these novels, did you have a sense that you were doing something special, something unique?
Look, no. I mean, certainly when I was writing the Torrent, my God, I was just learning. I was such a baby writer. I was just learning the whole thing, and I was just so kind of eager for feedback and for people to just like rip it apart and say, okay, tell me how to make it better, because I recognized that it was starting at the absolute bottom floor and just trying to work out how this stuff is put together. In hindsight, when publishers talk to you about things like that and go, okay, well, that version of a detective is not normally seen on the page, and so it's unique in that way. That version of fatherhood, who in the Torrent, Jeff is stay-at-home dad, perfectly comfortable doing that, does not feel kind of resentful for having to take on that role, is probably a little bit different space in the Taken, but we can talk about that. But essentially, just showing those more positive versions of fatherhood and like a committed relationship, who that's not where the tension is. The tension is all the other stuff. So I guess publishers and other people in the industry point that stuff out to you, and then you go, okay, well, I'm just going to take that and put that in my spiel when I talk about my book. But at the time when you're doing it, particularly when I was writing the Torrent, really, I was processing my own stuff. And as I keep talking about, I'm such a fan of crime fiction that it wasn't intentional, but when I started writing, that's the character that turned up. It was a detective, whilst I thought I was being incredibly clever in disguising all of my issues, turns out I was just totally just processing all my stuff through Kate. So Kate is a very thinly disguised version of all the issues that I think about. But then she was a detective, and then what she allowed me to do was not only process all that stuff, but escape from it, So I was then in a completely made up world, fighting crime, which is not something I do in my real life. And so I was able to completely escape from, all the other stuff that's going on in your life. And I think have your brain focus on like this completely arbitrary mystery that you're making up. It really is an escape.
Well, for those who haven't read either of your books yet, they are connected, aren't they?
They are connected. The Torrent, as you say, my debut, and it introduces the character of Detective Kate Miles, who is a police officer working in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, and it essentially kind of introduces her family and her police colleagues, and that those are essentially the people we follow. In the Torrent, Kate was very heavily pregnant, and that book covers the last week of her work before she went on maternity leave. And Taken then picks up her story, as you said, after she's come back to work from maternity leave about 4 months after the events of the Torrent. They're both absolutely standalone mysteries. The Torrent covers a mystery involving a death in floodwaters. This book involves a mystery involving an infant who's been apparently abducted from her home. So completely standalone mysteries, but certainly the characters are the same, and we are exploring kind of their overall arc. Because I guess for me, I am not a fan of series books and particularly TV series, I think, where you move on to the second season or whatever, and the hero appears to be completely reborn. Like there's no effect on all the horrible things that they had to do or they had to see, witness, or, experience in previous season. They're completely reborn. And if there is a reference, it's a passing reference to what they had to do. But I felt like in this book, I had to be honest to where she would be emotionally, and that, and she is absolutely dealing with the mental health fallout of some of the events that happen in the Torrent. And so she's suffering from some PTSD, and she is in an emotionally fragile state, which raises the tension, and so it just puts added pressure on everything else she has to do in the actual mystery. So
I was going to say she's at a difficult place emotionally, mentally, and physically when this book opens, and she's got a lot going on, and things only seem to get worse for her as the novel progresses. But I can't help but feel frustrated on her behalf. It feels like everyone around her is just waiting for her to screw up, and they're ready to pounce. They undermine her confidence in her ability to do her job. If she does well and, say, gets injured, her family is critical. If she doesn't go the extra mile, then she's not doing enough by, professional standards. I feel like she's damned if she does and damned if she doesn't. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think with Kate, the central tension with her character is she's incredibly good at her job. She's a highly competent cop, but that is also the thing that puts her in danger and places her, in opposition with her family in terms of the family's welfare and their welfare as a family. So that is the dichotomy, and that's the kind of the central push and pull of her character arc always. And she, as well as her family, as well as her husband, has to navigate that central problem. And if she was I guess in the equivalent position, if she was a man, she literally would not, they wouldn't be having that conversation. It would be like, that's the job. You just do it, right? And I guess that's why I get to kind of really dissect that issue a little bit more, because we're talking about Kate and motherhood, and she really, really wants to do the best for, on both sides. But she feels kind of stretched thin and she feels kind of pushed and pulled on both ends. And nobody's necessarily being, certainly from a family side, it's all coming from a place of love. It's all coming from a place of, they want her safe. They care for her welfare. So I don't think it's coming from a bad place. But at the same time, a lot of identity is caught up in her being a great cop. And that is part of her identity. She's worked very hard for that job. She's very good at it. And so she's like, well, I don't see any reason for giving it up. But at the same time, I'm interrogating those ideas around, can you do it all? And, and I think we are sold the idea that we can do it all. And actually we're set up to fail because we can't do it all. In her workplace, culturally, she is set up to fail in the sense that there aren't those systems set up around her office to make it, less of a thing for her to, pump her breast milk and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's not set up for that, So I guess it's pointing out that, like, there are system issues to make those things easier and make her work life easier, which aren't there, at least in her workplace. An individual can't do it all by themselves if there isn't a support system and structural system that is supporting them as well.
Do you think it is different, or are there different considerations for a woman doing this job? Or perhaps the question should be, should there be different considerations, especially when that woman has a family?
Yeah, well, I think it's a issue for all workplaces. I don't think the police force is necessarily any different, but I think particularly in kind of male, historically male-dominated workforces, culturally they are slowly shifting about how to make it more family-friendly, more female-friendly, to account for all stages of a female's life, right? And what I was trying to kind of show with this book, or like some of the things that I was thinking about with this book, was, I guess, this idea around, for a female, you're like, most of their life, or majority of their life is taken up by these care roles, and those care roles have a impact on their their employment, their ability to continue, like their earning capacity, and then they're super at the end of their working life. And then if at the end of their working life they're not in a partnership, then that means they're out there by themselves, alone, with no money, essentially. Then that is reflected in our society, because there's this huge kind of issue with female homelessness of females in their 50s and upwards in Australia, because of this exact issue of this structural, we haven't dealt with this structural issue. It's fine if the woman, if you're lucky enough to be in that committed relationship right to the end and you share your resources, that's great. But if that doesn't happen, so the idea that just because she's married now, she should give up this hard-won career, like, why should she? The man doesn't do that. Structurally, it's positioned such that there's a certain period of a woman's life where a whole bunch of women of certain generation kind of leave the workforce, and who was left gets the promotions, and they get the, and so then structurally it's really hard for those women to come back. It's reflected in, say, politics, where, women are, doing those roles, and, who have, women breastfeeding in Parliament House, or, like all those kind of things we're not used to as a society. Like, we have to actually change our lens and go, why is this weird? Why is this weird? It's a woman and she has a child, like, big deal. This is the stuff we do at home. I don't think the police force is necessarily any different. It just reflects the society that we're in.
Now, Kate has so much to deal with on an ordinary day, but this novel really tests her mettle, I think. The case of a missing baby is so close to home for Kate and brings up a lot of issues that she's struggling with herself. So I want to ask you, Dinuka, why did you want to torture her this way?
I know. I'm awful. I'm so sorry. But, like, it really does reflect how awful I am, because the minute I finished the Torrent and I started writing Taken, I just kind of knew exactly where her headspace will be. And so she was, incredibly vulnerable in terms of, how her baby comes into the world, or the second bub comes into the world, and some of the stuff that happened in the Torrent, which have really rattled her. So, what better case than to give her a case involving a little child, because that's the thing that's going to push her the most. And purely from a writing sense, you have this idea of, get a character, what is their vulnerability, push that vulnerability as far as that goes. So yes, so this absolutely reflects my horribleness. I just felt like with Kate, I knew what was going to rattle her the most. And so it felt obvious to me that the next case will be a case of a child. Yes.
Fair enough. Now, the mystery set up in the opening pages of this novel quickly gives way to a gripping police procedural. And I'm fairly certain I asked you this the last time we spoke, but was this always what you wanted to write, or was it more organic? And how do you fact check Kate's actions while she's on the job?
Yeah. Look, I think certainly this book is far more police and forensic detail and stuff like that. So I must admit, I worked really hard on this in terms of trying to make sure that the details were correct. In saying that, the majority of my process remained the same in that I tend to just write and I fact check as I go along. So literally from whatever that paragraph is, if I'm starting the paragraph with, the sun was hot or whatever, like I'll be checking, okay, what is, I'll be going, Murwillumbah weather in September. Right from that level of banal kind of research all the way to like the full-on forensic research that I had to do for this book as I go. So I never kind of go, okay, well, this book is about forensic stuff, so I'll spend a month now researching that and then I'll start writing. That's not my process. So my process is I will just write, and then literally whatever I write about at that point, there's some random scene that I put, like something was on the TV they were watching, was about fishing licenses, and I'm like, is there fishing in the Tweed River? Like literally I am Googling that, so it's just whatever I'm writing, I'll just research that as I go. And then I'm very lucky because I have this group of police procedural advisors. So my main advisor is a police officer who worked for the New South Wales police force, and now he's retrained as a criminal barrister. And so he has that knowledge from both ends. And his son is actually now in the police force as well. So he can kind of check things even as he reads it. So he does a full kind of manuscript review for me at the end when I put a full draft down. But as I say, like I fact checked as I go. So I think I'm a good enough researcher that I feel like I'm probably around 80% there-ish. And then he'll pick up the final things. In this one, I was very lucky to get my sister-in-law works for New South Wales Health, and she got me a contact with forensics. And he used to work for New South Wales Forensics, and now he's moved on. But again, he was brilliant. I was able to ask him questions and he pointed me in the right direction. And the mobile stuff was through my brother who works in mobile development. So I was asked, oh, can we do this? And he's like, no, you really cannot. And I'm like, are you sure? He's like, yes, I'm sure. So I had to change one plot point to do with that. And one of the forensic scenes changed based on the forensic person's advice. But apart from that, it was fine. It really mattered in this one because the reveal or the twist hangs on a forensic point.
Yes.
So if I screwed that up, that's the whole book gone. So I was really nervous that, it was all based on my own research. And then I sent it, okay, here are the questions. This is what the plot is based on. Here are my links, to the things I've researched, the papers I've researched. Is this correct? Do you think this is plausible? Da, da, da. And he was like, yep. So that was good. So that was like, oh, phew.
Now, what kind of feedback, and you may not have any, but I just wondered if you'd received any feedback about Kate as a character, say from someone in a similar situation or someone in the police service?
Oh, police service, I haven't had any feedback yet, which may be a good thing. I think the vast majority of feedback I get from readers is how much they connect to Kate. They really, I think for most people, it is really refreshing to see a version of themselves, I think, or the women that are very familiar to them. So their mothers, their sisters, their friends, their people from work. That is the version of a woman that Kate is, in the sense that professionally competent and juggling a million hats, feeling the expectations of all sorts of things, being a good daughter, being a good wife, being a good mother, being a good police officer. She takes on all of those. And I think we all do, trying to meet all our kind of masters in that way, trying to meet the expectations of all those masters. And so I think that version, even though, what she might be specifically doing, i.e. running after a criminal, might not be familiar, the guilt she feels, the feeling of never quite hitting the mark either at home or at work, feeling stretched and feeling kind of stretched thin, that feeling and that exhaustion and that constant self-talk, that is familiar to a lot of women. And I think that's what they respond to. So in that sense, I get a lot of feedback for Kate saying, I really connected to her. She's a great character. But I haven't yet got any feedback from the police side. And maybe I don't want any, because they'll be like, what is, when does that?
I'd love to know if there's anyone out there who have the same kind of emotional experiences that Kate's having, in both these
Yeah.
books.
Well, what I will say is anecdotally, what I've heard, I guess, speaking to my police contacts, is that in the same way that, say, in the medical profession, it's very difficult for a woman to carry on those senior roles, become a specialist, etc., without having that family support, right? Because it's a lot of hours, and you really have to put your whole heart and soul into it. And so a lot of female doctors who train medically end up becoming GPs, right? Because they can then manage their hours better and they can manage their families better. So in that same way, that's the kind of model I took for Kate, because in Kate being determined to maintain her detective status and still have a family is probably, so there's probably a lot of police officers out there who choose to be beat cops, and not beat cops, that's not the right word, but like uniform cops, to stay and not maybe potentially take on those specialist roles. Or if they do, they take on the specialist roles in more back of office type stuff, and not where they may be placed in danger kind of roles. And those are decisions they have to make in terms of, again, keeping a job that they really like, but also making space for their family. And so I just wanted to look at a character who just really wanted to be a detective, And also, I think I talked about this at an event I did, but this idea that we talk about work-life balance and how, whatever job we're trying to do, we have to be there for the family. But at the same time, when something goes wrong, I want the doctor there who's like, for me, whatever hour of the day. When my baby's coming out, I want the obstetrician who's like, not on holiday, or not, actually, I've got at my child's birthday. But actually, that has a cost to their family, right? Yeah. And we have this dual expectation all the time. So if I got into trouble, I would want Kate behind me, right? I would want these police officer who's completely dedicated, not who's looking at the watch and go, look, it's 4:00, I gotta go, see ya. It's this dual expectation we have of, no, we have to have this perfectly balanced family life, but also then we need these people when we need them. And so the issue is that there's always a compromise. There is never this perfect situation where you can have this for everyone. There is always a compromise. And I just wanted to show the reality of that. It's not necessarily condoning that behavior or anything like that, but it's just saying, like, this is the reality most of us are just muddling through. And half the time we get it right, most of the time, and we're just all muddling through. It doesn't mean we're bad people.
Yeah, so well said. Okay, changing tack for a moment here. Given your successes over the last few years, I wondered, Dinuka, if there was something you know now about yourself as a writer or about the industry that you wished you knew before you were published.
Ooh, good question. What I would say is, when I was trying to get published, that felt like the goal. Like, that felt like once you got that, it all works out. Like, it's just bam, it's done. But actually, when you get published, you realize that is like this one little hill of this mountain range. You suddenly see how far you got to go, right? Ultimately, I've fallen into this industry. I love it. For me, it'll be like this incredible thing for me to be able to look back and have an actual body of work behind me, right? And I realize now that it's not a book. It's your whole body of work. It's the whole career, and how you're going to manage that over the years. Torrent has got great feedback. Taken has got great feedback. But, there's never going to be this exponential rise, okay? There's going to be a point where my third book sucks, or it doesn't meet people's expectations, or doesn't meet their expectations of, this will be better than the next one, and then this will be better than the next one. And then, like that capitalistic rise, that's, again, not realistic, okay? And what I'm realizing is that it's now the issue of, now I have to manage a career, or I have to manage Like, how am I going to feel when, say, the third one maybe doesn't hit the mark to readers, right? Or I get negative reviews or whatever. How am I going to manage that? But will that define me as a writer, or do I use that to write another book? And ultimately 20 years from now, 30 years from now, people can look back and go, okay, she wrote how many books, and that is the body of work, and that's the body of work that needs to stand. And it cannot just be this one book, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I didn't realize. It's it's, this is just this is this one tiny little part of what you're hoping that you can continue to do, and continue to generate and continue to love, because the whole point of it is that it needs to be interesting for you, as well as a writer. It's not just a churning out of a product. I think I am realizing that actually that was a first step. I mean, it was a hard first step. Don't get me wrong. It was a steep first step. Like, you still have to do a crap load of work to get to that first step. So I'm not in any way downplaying all the work that people are doing to get that first book published. But then if you are into it, if you are trying to kind of continue to write and want to write, for a long time, that's then just becomes the first step in this huge mountain range, Yeah, and you see all the things that you still have to climb. So
do you have any advice for your unpublished self?
I would have advised my unpublished self to get myself a counsellor, just to get that mental health sorted, so that my self-worth is not based on whatever the hell people think about my book, because they're two separate things. And to have worked out earlier that all of this, it too will pass, even if I stuff up something or whatever. This is me with all the mistakes and the insecurities and the imperfections, and you either take it or leave it, and accept me as not this perfect thing that will always say the right thing, or or whatever, right? Because you take on all of that, because you feel like every time you step up in front of a microphone, you have to get it perfectly right. Otherwise people will think things, all that stuff, right? There's all those expectations that you add to the experience, when really all you started off as was just really liking writing, and you didn't realize that then you had to be good at speaking about it and getting up on stage and giving interviews and doing, all this stuff, which then people kind of use, and, and you see different versions of yourself in all sorts of media, and you see various different photos of yourself as well. And all of that adds to, if you're not ready for it, and if you're not if you can't step back from it, it can add to that mental load. So still on my to-do list of getting a proper freaking psychologist too.
I think you touch on a really important point here. I have seen it myself. You see writers who simply written a book and have had it published, and that is an incredible achievement in itself, but then suddenly, and much to their chagrin, are pushed into the limelight and are expected to be able to talk publicly about their books, when writers are so often introverts. Not all, but many writers are introverts and are unprepared for that set of expectations which are being placed on them. That's not to say that they can't do it or it's not a reasonable expectation, but I think just so often people are just not prepared, just don't think that having a book published is going to lead to having to put themselves out there. It is often difficult to put yourself out there and have people thinking or judging or having that weight of expectation placed on your shoulders.
Also that idea around goalpost changing, because again, as I said, I feel like before you get published, that's the goal. That's and you think it's amazing. But then you get to that goal, and then suddenly things like, oh, am I getting reviews? Am I getting the festival invites? Am I getting the long listings and the short listings? And am I getting the, all of that suddenly, because you're now part of this writing community, and all of that is your social media feed, right? And so you would not be human if that stuff did not enter your brain. You can't help it, right? That's just the way it is. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or that you're a bad person. It's just because you're part of that community and you cannot help but absorb all this stuff. And I think it's worth remembering to think back to the version of yourself 5 years ago, who just wanted that book on the shelf, and to kind of high five that version, of yourself, past you going, you know what, we did the thing, screw the rest of the stuff, like we did the thing, job done, goodbye. And if you wanted to end there, job done, like you did it, full stop, move away. But if you want it to be this ongoing thing, like a long-term venture, long-term kind of career, you have to accept that is now part of the world. Like with any profession, there are stuff that is part of that world, and some of that stuff comes naturally. A lot of that stuff you have to learn and get better with practice. This is just part of that world. And I think, some techniques, some genuine techniques of like calming yourself before you go on stage, or, like all of that stuff, would be helpful.
For what it's worth, I think you're doing a fabulous job.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, Dinuka, so what's next? Will we see Kate in another novel?
Yes, Kate is, yes, in theory, Kate is being written into another novel. My agent and my publisher, we laugh about this. Well, I mean, they laugh at me, but, because I'm totally in that second book syndrome at the moment, because Taken was essentially written, before the Torrent came out, actually. I submitted that in October 2021, and then the book came out in February 2022. So Taken was done, yes, I edited it, but essentially both those books were written before anyone had eyes on my writing. And now people have eyes on my writing, and it's like, whoa, that's in my head. Yeah. So yes, so in theory, I am writing 3.
Fantastic. I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah, anyway, it's being written. I don't that's what I mean about that whole thing of like, God, what if you don't hit the mark? Because now it really feels like a bar has been set that you have to meet, but it's trying to find that space in the writing that you loved in the first place. I used to go into Kate's world to escape it all. Now when I go into Kate's world, sometimes that world seeps in and I'm just a bit like, so it's also managing that. Yes, so there's definitely a third Kate Miles.
Dinuka, if listeners wanted to connect with you or learn more about you and your books, how can they do that?
Yes, so I have a website, DinukaMcKenzie.com, and that has, blurbs of the 2 books and links where you can buy them, and also events list. So that's probably has the consolidated events list where you can come and see me. And then I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. Probably I used to be really active on Twitter. Like just the recent changes to Twitter have not been conducive to. Yes, it's not as amazing as it used to be. Anyway, so I'm probably more on Instagram now, to be perfectly honest.
Dinuka, I'm vicariously delighting in your success with both the Torrent and Taken. I wanted to say congratulations and thank you for joining me again on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine. Honestly, I love this podcast and thank you so much for having me back. It really means so much. Thank you.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.